HGSE alum to today's faculty fireside chat. I'm Emily Williams, Director of Alumni Engagement and Lifelong Career Development, and we're so happy to have you all here as one of our initiatives to further engage our alums and bring our faculty to all of you for an exclusive alumni talk. Before we get started, I have some light housekeeping items. As you can see, we're hosting today's session in a meeting style, so feel free to keep your camera on or turn it off, whichever is your preference. We will be recording today's session and distributing it to all who have registered. You'll also notice that you're currently muted, and we do ask that you remain muted when you're not participating in the question and answer section of today's session. We'd love to get a sense of who's here today, so put in the chat your HGSE degree, program, or concentration, where you're joining us from, and your current role. We know we have many superintendents and school leaders, but welcome all audience members, of course. And lastly, we do have closed captioning available for today's session. If you'd like to see the captions, please click on the CC/live transcript button, then click on show subtitle. You can turn off subtitles by clicking on live transcript, then click hide subtitle. And now I will introduce today's speakers, HGSE faculty member, Dr. Jennifer Cheatham, Ed.M 06, Ed.D 10, and our distinguished guest and former superintendent, Dr. Cohn, speaking today on the politics of the superintendency. So please join me in welcoming Jen and Carl. Thank you both for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Emily. It is great to see everyone. A real pleasure to talk to HGSE alumni today. I am a graduate of the Urban Superintendents Program, and after graduating from HGSE, I went on to work in San Diego and Chicago in senior leadership roles, and then in Madison, Wisconsin, where I was the superintendent for 6 years. And I do want you all to know my connection to my colleague, Cohn. When I was at HGSE, I was assigned a mentor. Carl was the superintendent in San Diego at the time. And one of the many reasons that I wanted to work with Carl was because he was known for his political prowess. And even back then, I understood that instructional and managerial leadership would not be enough. And I needed to understand how to get things done in a political environment. I'm forever thankful to Carl for his mentorship, especially on that front. Carl, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your connection to Harvard?
Sure. Well, before I got into education, I studied to be a Roman Catholic priest for 9 years. Abandoned that, this is ancient history, abandoned that a few days after Richard Nixon was elected president of the United States, and walked into a personnel office of a troubled school district, and that was the beginning of my career. Ultimately, I became superintendent of schools in Long Beach, and Harvard had this really good idea that incredibly talented, smart people ought to embrace the superintendency. And so Jen, when I was in San Diego, was the third Harvard intern that I had. And with apologies to the first two, Jen was the most talented. And that's how our relationship started. But we've stayed connected over the years. I'm now emeritus at Claremont, senior research fellow, which allows me to engage in fun things that I'm really interested in. I've always been a political junkie, and so this kind of topic is something that I feel like I'm a kid in the candy store, having a boatload of fun. I'm not sure I'd want to be running a school system right now. Enough about me.
Well, that's what we'll be talking about today. So Carl and I have stayed connected over all those years, and so thankful to the HGSE community for bringing us together. And most recently, in the last, I don't know, it's been a year and a half now, Carl and I have been digging into this kind of issue around what's happening with the politics of the superintendency. The project that we've been leading, which I'd love to tell you all a little bit about, was really born from an article that Carl wrote for the School Administrator magazine. They asked him to write an article on the state of the superintendency. That article is called An Impossible Position. And it really covered, at the time, the political challenges that superintendents were facing across the country. And there was a lot of reaction to it. There was a lot of interest and energy around it. And as a result, the Hewlett Foundation and the W.T. Grant Foundations gave us some funding to bring together a group of people just to make sense out of what's happening in the field. That group of people, this happened last June, included a subset of superintendents who work in a variety of contexts, a handful of political ed scholars, and the people who lead major organizations that prepare and support superintendents. That conversation just confirmed how dramatically the political landscape was changing at the local level. We all know what's happening with the country's red-blue divide, but we really were talking about how that was playing out in local school governance, where schools, superintendents and board members were really having to almost like choose sides, right? Were they going to be equity warriors or culture warriors? And the initial convening really helped to elicit what was happening in the field. The political ed scholars were talking about how conservative organizations were well organized, right? And really seeking to curtail equity initiatives, especially in communities where the demographics were changing, suburban communities in many instances, but even in the urban school districts that we're probably most familiar with, superintendents were facing challenges, especially in political hotspots like Florida and Texas. And we've been seeing that incumbent school board members are sometimes losing their seats to these well-organized conservatives. So our primary concern at the end of the day is not so much about the politics. I think we want to be really clear about that, but about the efforts that are underway to reduce our ability to move forward initiatives that address inequality in public education, right? We are very concerned that our DEI initiatives, the instructional methods that we've introduced over the years that focus on the integration of academic and social emotional learning, the strategies that we've been using to reduce disparities in things like school discipline are under attack. And they are being met with competing efforts to limit what's being taught in school classrooms. We're very concerned about that. And that is why we're so interested in this topic. Ultimately, where we stand is that we believe superintendents need support navigating these political challenges, and that by doing so, we can not only protect our work, focus on addressing inequality, but we can lay a path forward for a larger swath of the public to be committed to the health of our public education system. So we've got this project, it's got a set of goals that include gathering data on the state of the superintendency, communicating. We want more people to understand that understanding, communicating and deepening that understanding, and maybe most importantly, inspiring action among the organizations that prepare and support superintendents with a very specific focus on navigating today's political landscape. So that's a project in a nutshell. And what Carl and I thought we would do is first start with his telling you all a story. Just one story, right, that we think elicits what's happening out in the field. And then we'll unpack that story a little bit and talk about what we think are some of the big lessons and areas of inquiry for not just our work, but all of our collective work. And then we'll open it up for some conversation and questions. So Carl, tell us the story. I'll hand it over to you.
So I'm here at my house in Palm Springs, California, which is a part of Riverside County. And an evangelical pastor came up with a term that caught my attention. He declared that the public schools are the devil's playground. And I decided I need to find out what's going on in this southwest Riverside County where this pastor is. He declared that he was going to elect school boards. He had something he was calling the Inland Empire Family Political Action Committee. And he had an NFL type draft in the spring where candidates could come commit to his agenda, which included complete control by parents, getting rid of all forms of woke indoctrination, all of this preoccupation with equity, all of this perverted sense of indoctrination of school children at early ages with regard to a menu of gender choices that they could choose from, basically declaring this is the devil's work. So I was fascinated by his laying down this marker, and about a month before the November 8th election, I went down there to meet with the superintendents of the school systems where the pastor was fielding a candidate. And I asked them, what do you think's going to happen on November 8th? They said, we think our incumbents will be safe. Comes November 8th, 5 out of 7 of the pastor's candidates win election to the school board, including a majority in the Temecula Valley Unified School District, the 4th largest school district in Riverside County. Again, this whets the appetite of a political junkie like myself. So I showed up for the first school board meeting of the new school board majority. Overwhelming attendance. I walked in, I sat down next to a suburban mom, and I asked her, why are you here? And she said, my daughter told me you need to come, my high school age daughter told me you need to come to the school board meeting because you adults really messed up on November 8th. And you need to come and find out how bad you've messed up. So that was my introduction to a member of the Temecula community. But all the things that you would think might unfold with the new school board majority did. They passed a resolution against racism, which meant can't talk about anything that offends us. And then they passed a second resolution banning critical race theory in the district. And it was fascinating to watch really articulate high school students appear at the board meeting and give impassioned testimony about their desire to learn the real history of our country and everything that goes with that. Following the passage of those resolutions, the next day, students began walking out of the various high schools to protest the new school board. One of the things that is, and obviously I'm going to follow this story as it develops, but one of the things that's just a huge concern of mine, I still encounter veteran school superintendents who view politics
Right.
as evil or bad. And whenever I teach the politics course to aspiring young people who want to be superintendents, I always start with my visit to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, right there where you all are. I don't know if you've been there, but when you walk up the steps and you look at the masthead of that library, it says, dedicated to the memory of our nation's 35th president, and to all those who through the art of politics seek a new and better world. And my argument today is that school superintendents, because of the nature of their work, should be the best practitioners in the world of politics. And that's what the big value added is in terms of my own contribution to those who are preparing to become superintendents. And I don't hide the fact that throughout my time in Long Beach, where I spent a decade, I endorsed candidates for the school board. Obviously, it's something controversial. The editor of the local newspaper was a good friend who supported our efforts, would always write an editorial saying, Carl Cohn is trying to pick his bosses. And I would respond in a friendly way saying, if everybody else gets to pick their bosses through their unions, why should only the superintendent be silent? And, you know, we had a good working relationship, but obviously it's risky. In 10 years, I, guessed wrong once. And the person, after they were sworn in as a new school board member, gave a 2-minute speech describing my behavior as reprehensible. And I sat there and took it. That's politics. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And I knew that going forward initially, support for me would be 4-1 rather than 5-0. But in terms of taking a stand with regard to what our children need, I have never apologized for that. Anyway, that's kind of my passion, what brings me to this work.
So Carl, that story that you tell is so interesting to me, especially juxtaposed against what you just described, which is what your experience was like in Long Beach. But that was a while ago now, right? Things have changed.
Absolutely. Yep.
Before we get into what we think may be the lessons, right, that are instructive for those of us who lead in school districts or support those who lead in school districts, I want to unpack this story. Like, what makes what's happening now different from the political world, right, that you navigated? Because when you taught me and we learned in the Urban Superintendents Program about navigating the political realm, it was always about the union, right? Building strong relationships with your union partners, for sure. Susan Moore Johnson taught us a lot about how to do so, as did you. We learned a lot about working with the media and just thinking, deeply about communications, including doing things like meeting regularly with your editorial boards, making sure that that was a strong relationship. And of course, we talked a lot about board politics, right? How to conduct the care and feeding of your school board and enable them to do their best work. And you're kind of taking that to the next level by suggesting that that could also look like endorsing potential superintendent candidates. But like, what's So that's the way it's always been. But what's different that's happening now? Like, what makes it
Sure.
especially challenging?
So the late John McCain, I believe, gave us the best insight to what's changed. John McCain said, in the Republican Party, we used to keep our crazies under wrap. Trump unleashed them. And that is the big difference, that people, for whatever reason, were often seen as outside the mainstream, nutcases, that sort of thing. And now Trump, for, no matter how we feel about Trump, he unleashed forces in the country that I believe gave legitimacy to more extreme views. The other thing that happened, and this is what some of the Politics of Ed scholars told us at our convening back last June, the right in America is much better organized than the progressive left. And I think we see evidence of that everywhere. Tonight in the Bay Area, there'll be a San Ramon Valley School District Board meeting where the topic is book banning. And if you had told me 10 years ago that a suburban Bay Area school district would, be turning out hundreds of people to talk about banning books, I would have said no way. And I think this degree of legitimacy has changed the political dynamics. I go to Ralph Reed, who said in the 90s, you give me 1,000 school board members across the country, and I don't need to elect a president of the United States. So while we sometimes salute the 2022 election results in terms of states and national, I think the strategy is we are not going to take it over necessarily by big national or state elections. We're going to take it over at the local level. That's how and school boards. The other thing is, people actually, and this is a good thing, people actually care about K-12 kids. That's huge, and I've worked in K-12 and I've worked in higher ed, and I used to say to my higher ed colleagues, by the way, with apologies to all the higher ed people, nobody really cares about kids in higher ed. They care about K-12 kids. So I think that's the other thing that makes this so ripe for examination and scrutiny. People really care about kids in K-12 systems.
They care about their children, right?
Yep.
Makes sense. So yeah, I just want to emphasize like this idea that what we're seeing that's different is national politics playing out at the local level, right? Very different from what at least I've seen in the past. Superintendents using kind of the old set of political strategies and being taken by surprise, right? Your point about the fact that some of the superintendents that you talked to were assuming the incumbents would win, right? This is a problem. And I'll just add one more bit of complexity before we get into potential lessons and area of inquiry, which is that there are other political pressures still at play. I was at where I've been working with a superintendent and observed her board meeting recently. I described this for you, Carl, where their union negotiations are at a standstill.
Right.
So during the board meeting, there were union members standing around, like holding signs in the background, pointing to lack of confidence in their leadership, meaning both the superintendent and the school board. Simultaneously, the first hour of public comment was from Black parents in this particular community who feel like the school district has not been doing enough to keep their children safe, both physically and psychologically, right? So there are multiple pressures, right, that have increased, that have been amplified since the pandemic. And now we also have this kind of partisan politics playing out in school districts, which is this new element.
Right.
Yeah, and you talked with me recently about the kind of dynamic of strange bedfellows. So interestingly, there may be people who have very different kind of values and beliefs, but who are finding common issues and applying pressure to school districts and to superintendents across the United States. I feel like that's new as well.
It is new. There are a bunch of professional women in the Bay Area during the height of the pandemic. They're from Berkeley and Oakland. They started an organization called Reopen California Schools. And it is now morphed into an organization called California Parent Power. But basically, they are so upset about how long California public schools stayed closed that they've also thrown in with anti-vaxxers and a whole host of people. And the message is, no matter what happens with regard to public health, don't you ever close the public schools again. Ignore the California Department of Public Health, ignore governors. So part of the reason why I know these women, during the height of the pandemic, I wrote a piece suggesting that if Governor Newsom really wanted to get the schools open faster, he should have temporarily suspended local collective bargaining, sat down with the unions statewide and agreed on a date to reopen California schools, rather than leaving it up to more than 1,000 school districts to negotiate the reopening of schools. That piece got me in trouble with all of my union friends, that sort of thing, but I got a new following with regard to parents and especially professional women who were upset having to deal with their childcare for their kids. So you now have this coming together of strange bedfellows and forces saying, you know, no matter what the next pandemic is, under no circumstances can the public schools ever close again. And there's a movement to put that in initiative form in California, amend the state constitution under the guise of a high quality education provided to every youngster. And they are interpreting a high quality education as no Zoom ever, no Zoom school ever again.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do. The three kind of overarching inquiry questions that we have for our project, I just want to share those with the group. And in fact, I'll maybe throw these in the chat for everyone so you can see them. is first, what is the political role of the superintendency today? What are the associated knowledge, skills, and dispositions? Secondly, how should superintendent prep and training programs change to face this new and emerging reality? And very specifically, how can we develop superintendent's ability to develop affirmative visions that can be embraced across political divides, communicate in ways that unify, and cultivate the political acumen to work across lines of difference, especially with parents. So there are three things that came up at our convening and that continue to come up, Carl. And the first one is this idea of superintendents as really like moral leaders, honestly. How can they help with their communities develop an affirmative vision that more people can get behind, right? So that we're bridging these divides, having conversations about the purpose of schooling beyond learning literacy and mathematics, better defining what skills, abilities we want our graduates to attain, right? When they get that diploma, this kind of visioning seems especially crucial now. And I will say that this may be another resource that we could look for, but Ross Wiener, who is a member of our collaborative and works at the Aspen Institute, he wrote a really wonderful piece on this subject of affirmative visioning for the most recent School Administrator magazine. But what are your thoughts on this, Carl?
Well, for me, the question, and I am not in the chair, I'm not running a district, but I encounter superintendents who believe first that if I'm serving all kids and I remain neutral in politics, I'll be fine. And my question to them is, when in the course of human history has, in the face of immorality and aggression, has neutrality paid off? I'm a total glutton for punishment. I get the pastor's weekly newsletter every Monday. The pastor believes that the public schools should not serve all children. He does not apologize. He says that if you see any of this gender stuff going on in your home, you shut that down. You do not allow that out of your house. You don't allow that to be taken to the public school system. So for me, when someone says you cannot serve all kids unless they comport with a traditional conservative view of literally the Bible, that absolutely, in my judgment, requires a moral response from those who are charged with taking care of all kids. So if you really understand where this pastor is coming from, I don't see any middle ground, any kind of a compromise when someone says you will not serve all kids in the public schools.
Agreed. I mean, I'm so with you on that, Carl. I have a few thoughts on this. Building on what you just talked about, I think, I mean, there is such a void of moral leadership right now, and superintendents are really well positioned to help fill that void. I know it's scary. It's always been scary to some degree. And I mean, you really do put yourself on the line in these roles by saying what needs to be said, but without being accusatory. I think we need as many superintendents who can and are willing to be unapologetic about what it is that, who it is that we're trying to serve, what we believe schooling is all about. And I think the pandemic taught us about the role that schooling plays in making our communities healthy and vibrant places for every child and every family. And I think trying to ongoingly develop a more robust vision that more people can get behind. Like, you can't just say, you have to engage people, right, in the process of visioning about what schooling is all about. And there are lots of school districts out there these days who have developed graduate visions, or these like portraits of a graduate. I don't know if you're aware of this, Carl, but it's really powerful, but it can be sort of unfortunately like dangerously technical, like it's just like the slick document with that lacks meaning. Like, it's all about the process. I guess that's what I'm saying, about getting your community and as many people as possible in your community to weigh in about what we all want for our children, or what most of us certainly want for our children, and keep people engaged in that conversation seems especially important.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
Earlier you asked about what's different from, my time and today. And the other big factor that we all have to acknowledge is the pandemic. The pandemic closed off access to public schools. I've been volunteering in a first grade class for more than 20 years on the North Long Beach Compton border, Colin Powell School. For 2 years and 2 months, I did not have access to my first graders. So when you think about that, you wonder, how could a pastor come along with this devil's playground thing and actually mobilize people? But in the absence of access, all kinds of things can happen. And so I think we need to double down, and we need to recognize that the pandemic really changed some dynamics. My final full-time job was heading up a small state agency, and we were working with 20 California districts. And one of them, the Anaheim Union High School District, this was long before the pandemic, they sat down with their teacher union. They came up with something that they call parent empowerment walks. Parents come to school. You get a quick acknowledgement that for 45 minutes to an hour, you're going to go with a group of teachers and administrators to visit classrooms at the school. At the end of that time, you're going to come back, you're going to have a debrief, you're going to get your questions answered, and you can see how, if a pastor came along and said they're the devil's playground, and you had parents saying, you know what, right, I've been in those classrooms, and you were talking a bunch of whatever. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to double down on new strategies that do, in fact, give greater access, and all of those things where traditionally we thought we were winning parents over. We need to look at that, and we need to think clearly about what are those other things, and we need to listen carefully.
I love that, Carl. So in addition to developing this affirmative vision with your community, like this just like hyperactive focus on relationship building and trust building, and I love the example of the parent walks. I think I told you recently that I haven't set foot in my own child's classroom since pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
I haven't been in the halls of his school. And right, it's just mind-boggling to me. So that's happening to me. That's happening with all kinds of parents all across this country. And yeah, we start to make things up when we don't get to be there and see it up close. Whole idea of like physical presence, now that we can do it again, like how do we lean into it? I'll just give one other quick example on this. I used to meet quite regularly with a group of conservative Christian parents when I was a superintendent in Madison, who had worries about the SEL curriculum that we were
Sure.
teaching, the work that we were doing on gender. And it was, though, that space was just such a humanizing space, right? I got to really understand their real concerns. I got to clarify the misperceptions that they had about what was happening. I mean, we would open up lesson plans and look at them together and learn that we had more in common about what we were striving to accomplish in classrooms than not. But anyway, just more examples about how important it is to build relationships with all parents. The other thing that's been on my mind, and I know we've talked a lot about, it came up at our convening, is our attention to language use. I mean, right now there are all these kind of dog whistle terms like critical race theory. I mean, what are your thoughts, Carl, on what we should be doing as political leaders when it comes to language?
Right. Yeah, and this again can get me into trouble. So I was working with a local school district outside of Sacramento. And I said, the most important thing is to implement programs that are focused on equity and reducing inequality. And I said, you don't need to pass a resolution. You don't need to fly an airplane with a banner that says we're all about equity if it's going to trigger these folks. One of the school board members said, oh no, I disagree. I want to flush out all of the racists in this community. And I thought, you know what? As a white male labor leader in the Capitol, who lives in this community, is on the school board, you may well survive flushing out all the racists in the community. But the person who's probably going to not benefit from your flushing out all the racists is your new first female, first African-American superintendent in the district. The work is to get help to youngsters who historically have been underserved, whether or not, you announce yourself as an equity warrior. I don't think any of that is really important. Remembering my background, studying to be a priest, you're not supposed to get any recognition in this life for the good things that you do. So for me, this has always been about how can we create an environment in schools that dramatically changes how historically underserved kids are treated. So, and I'm willing to admit that not everybody's going to jump on board with that. And then in certain communities, people are really going to want to know the extent to which you register on certain commitment to equity scales.
It's all about knowing your community at the end of the day, right? It depends. I mean, my take on this is we always need to name problems explicitly. And when it comes to problems that are rooted in racism, it's helpful to be able to take a historical view, right? So that it's not about blaming, but like explaining, right? Like let's together cultivate a shared understanding about how we got here. right? That's different. I do think it's important to avoid trigger words when you know that they are indeed triggering to your community, and but that requires knowing the work so well that you can use more descriptive language, right? Like instead of using the term SEL, in fact, there's another great resource that a colleague recently sent to me about exactly this, about how, in fact, I'll send it as a follow-up to the group. Like, how can we talk about things like social emotional learning using more descriptive language that people can get behind? Because really, generally, people want these things for their children. Anyway, so I think that is big, but I'm noticing the time, and we have about 15 minutes left, and I would love to talk with our group. And I've seen these names. We know quite a few of you. So we would love, I'm going to pass it back to Emily to see if we can get some questions or thoughts from
Awesome.
the crowd. Yeah, thanks, Emily.
Thank you both. This is a great conversation. We have a couple of questions that were pre-submitted, but if you have questions as you're listening now, I want to throw them in the chat. We'll see how many we can get to and maybe include some resources to follow up on those that we can't get to. We're going to start with a pre-submitted question, though, that was entered on our alumni community site by one of our ED/LD alums, Adriana Chavarin Lopez. And she asks, would restructuring the position of the superintendency help to recruit and retain candidates? If so, what are your thoughts on how the position of the superintendency could be restructured?
This came up at our convening back in June, right, Carl? We talked about the superintendent's job today. If we all agree that the political nature of the job has dramatically increased, the superintendent is likely doing a lot more like outward, facing engagement. And you kind of really need to duplicate yourself so that you also have someone who is really working on internal engagement. Yeah, what do you think?
When I was superintendent in Long Beach, we had incredibly large high schools, 4,500, that sort of thing. And one of the talented high school principals came to me and he said, you're always talking about, high schools instruction ought to be evaluated. And I can tell you, we can't get there. But if you allowed us to have co-principals, we could actually make sure that all the managerial things get taken care of and instruction would be looked at on a daily basis. And we went with it and it works very successfully. It violates all the organizational principles that I'm sure the Harvard Business School has honed into people about, knowing exactly who the boss is, that kind of thing. But in practice, it actually worked. And given the demands on the superintendency today, I don't think it would be an answer for every community, but if you really knew, understood, and engaged your community, I think there are some possibilities here. I'm not aware of any place that's taken that step, but I think it's something that could be looked at given the multiple demands. The worst thing would be if a superintendent today is so busy with other things that they ignore the politics of the job.
Or vice versa.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, you're so busy with the politics that you've lost sight of the strategy. I don't know that the job should be changed. Well, I don't know. I think I would be thinking about who I needed on my leadership team so that I can be free to do the political work that only I can be doing as a leader, as a community leader.
Right. And as you know, Jen, there are all kinds of women out there who are the smartest people in the room when it comes to instructional leadership. Right?
We're pretty good political leaders too, Carl. All right, let's go to another question.
Next question comes from Judith Pace on today. Thank you for joining us. How should superintendents work with and probably, right, support teachers? Should teachers be prepared to do anything differently?
Yeah, Carl, it looks like you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, one of the things that served me well, and California is a dyed-in-the-wool collective bargaining state. It's never going to go away. I used to visit the schools with the president of the teachers union, and a couple things happened. We were modeling how people work together. We also were suggesting that listening to teachers was an essential part of the work. Both the superintendent and the leader of the union are taking a risk by going to schools together. What I found, 3 different presidents of the union over a 10-year period, the union found out that by going to schools with the superintendent, 100% of the teachers turned out. And they got a much better picture of their membership than the usual sitting in the faculty lounge at lunchtime and listening to a small group of whiners and complainers. So I think this business of how you get teachers really engaged, and then we would follow up. If major things were in fact revealed, we followed up on that, we took action, and it was a reminder of how the teachers union and the leadership of the system ought to work together. And what was fascinating about that, and sometimes some superintendents don't get it, the fact that we modeled that made negotiations go much, much easier. So in 10 years, no brinksmanship, no, threats of a strike, that type of thing. The leadership of both the union and the district were modeling cooperation. And so much of this grows out of, I was a school counselor, and listening as a leader, there's no skill that's more important than that. And I think sometimes we all need to be reminded of that.
Yeah, no question. Teachers also need to know that we have their backs and that they're not going to be left out, hanging, right? When the parent complaint comes our way, right? I just think that they need to know that up front, during, after, right? Like we got it covered. Mm-hmm.
On a practical political level, a better relationship with your union can in fact produce better results in school board elections.
100%.
So one of the things I'm going to do as a follow-up is get together with these superintendents, including Temecula, and talk about this issue. When I went down there a month before the election, if they had a stronger mobilization with their unions in terms of voter turnout, could they have made a difference in not allowing the pastor's slate to get elected?
No doubt. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, that's a whole other episode to come on building strong union relationships and why. Mm-hmm. Should we go to another question? I just want to make sure we get maybe at least one more in.
Yeah, I'm not seeing too many other questions, although Judith did have a follow-up question. And Phil, I saw you put a comment in there, but it looks like you might have got cut off. So feel free to edit that. But one of the questions that was sort of an add-on to that last question was, and I apologize for my dog, how can superintendents work against the chilling effect of politics? And not one that to answer in 5 minutes, I'm sure.
You know, it is one of the things I cited in this latest school administrator piece was, you know, the classic Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. David Brooks now says, all politics is national. And that in and of itself can bring a chilling effect. But I think doubling down on getting to know your community. And the other thing is your community knowing you.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I had greater success in Long Beach was the community knew this poor kid came from our community, and he doesn't have to spend a lot of time convincing us that he's committed to equity, that he's committed to all these other things. We're looking at an African-American person who came from a single parent household in our community, whose mother was a victim of domestic violence. He doesn't have to talk a lot about how important getting a good education is. So again, I think understanding that these national issues are now going to be brought to the local level, it's important for us to double down even more around taking what I would call a basically moral stand about, again, this issue of serving all kids.
My answer to that question would be that to address the chilling effect on teachers, but really on everyone, is to not work in isolation. I remember I wasn't great about attending like the Superintendent Association meetings, and I don't know, I was just so busy. But having community, right, building spaces for teachers to talk with one another about what's happening, to make sense and support one another, spaces where principals can do the same. Superintendents need that same form of community more than ever, I think. We have to balance that with the fact that you shouldn't necessarily leave your school district when things are chaotic, right? Don't go to the conference necessarily on that day. Be smart about it, but we need community, and I just want to encourage everyone to find it, to say yes, to offer up space for sense making. I think that will help us stay more resilient during what are really dangerous times.
Sure.
That's a great note, because here we are having this community right here. So thanks, Jen, for circling that around. And now that we have approached the top of the hour, I just want to give you two an opportunity to say any final thoughts before we end today's session.
I would argue, see yourself as the next generation of people committed to that masthead at the Kennedy Library. You're gonna seek a new and better world for school children. That's your calling, that's your commitment, and that's what you want to define you.
And I just want to encourage people to reach out to me at the school, to Carl, if you're willing, if you have stories, thoughts, strategies. I mean, we're really committed to supporting the field at a crucial time, and would welcome your support. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Jen. We appreciate you so much. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.